Chapter 2. Fly Away. While the children were sleeping, the window opened. A boy entered the room. A bright light followed him in. The boy and the light looked at all the children's toys and clothes. They were looking for Peter's shadow. The bright light was really a fairy, no bigger than your hand. It was a girl fairy called Tinker Bell. She was dressed in a leaf. When she talked, it sounded like golden bells. That was the fairy language. Peter and Tinker Bell found his shadow in a big box. Peter tried to put his shadow back on, but it wouldn't stick to him. Peter tried to make his shadow stick to him with some soap from the bathroom, but that didn't work either. So, Peter sat on the floor and cried. The sound of Peter crying woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. She was not surprised to see a strange boy crying on the floor. "Boy," she said, "why are you crying?" Peter looked up. He remembered his manners, so he bowed to her. Wendy bowed back. "What's your name?" Peter asked. "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," she said. "What is your name?" "Peter Pan." Wendy asked where Peter lived and where his mother was. "I don't have a mother," he said. "That's why you were crying," Wendy said. She got out of bed and ran to him. "I wasn't crying about mothers," he said. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow back on." Wendy saw the shadow on the floor. "How terrible," she said. Wendy knew what to do. "I'll sew it on for you," she said. And she sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. Peter was very happy about getting his shadow back. He danced around the room. Then he gave Wendy a gift. It was a small button. "Thank you," Wendy said. She put the button on a chain around her neck. It was lucky that she did. The button would later save her life. Peter told Wendy a little about himself. "I ran away the day I was born," he said. "I ran away because I heard my mother and father talking about what I would be when I became a man. But I don't want to be a man. I want to be a little boy forever and have fun. So I ran away and lived with the fairies." Wendy thought it was wonderful that Peter knew fairies. She asked him many questions about them. Peter told her about the beginning of fairies. When the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces. The pieces flew all over the world. That was the beginning of fairies, Peter said. Wendy liked this story, but there was a sad part to it. "Children don't believe in fairies anymore," Peter said. And every time a child says, "I don't believe in fairies," a fairy dies. Then Peter remembered Tinker Bell and called out, "Tinker Bell, where did you go?" The sound of golden bells came from the big box. Peter laughed. He forgot he closed Tinker Bell in there. He let her out, and she flew around the room, angry. It was the first time Wendy had seen a fairy. She thought Tinker Bell was beautiful. But Tinker Bell said she thought Wendy was a big, ugly girl. She did not like Peter having other friends who were girls. Peter told Wendy more about himself. He said he lived with a group of boys called the Lost Boys. He was their leader. They all lived far away on an island called Neverland. Peter said he came to Wendy's window at night to listen to stories. "I don't know any stories. None of the Lost Boys knows any stories," Peter said. "How terrible," Wendy said. "I know lots of stories. I could tell stories to the Lost Boys." "Wendy, come with me," Peter said. Wendy wanted to go to Neverland, but she was worried about leaving her mother and father, and she didn't know how to fly. "I can teach you how to fly," Peter said. Wendy was excited. She woke up her little brothers, John and Michael. "Wake up! Peter Pan will teach us to fly," she told them. Peter flew around the room to show them. "Wonderful," said John and Michael. "You just think happy thoughts," Peter explained. "They pull you up in the air." It looked very easy. They tried from the floor. They tried from their beds. But every time they tried, they went down instead of up. But Peter knew no one can fly unless they have fairy dust on him. Peter took some dust from Tinker Bell. Then he put a little on each of them. The next time the children tried, they flew. They were not as good as Peter, but they went up, down, around, and around. "Let's all go out!" cried John. "Come!" Peter cried. He flew out the window into the night. Wendy, John, and Michael followed. Earlier that night, when Peter came in through the window, Nana felt there was danger in the children's room. She was a dog, and she knew these things. She had to let Mr. and Mrs. Darling know, but she was tied up in the yard. She pulled and pulled at the rope that tied her. Finally, she broke the rope and ran from the yard. She ran down the street to the house where Mr. and Mrs. Darling were at the party. Nana ran into the house and jumped at Mr. and Mrs. Darling. They suddenly knew something terrible was happening in the children's room. They left the party and ran back to their house. But by that time, it was too late. the children's room was empty.